Does Romans 13 mean we must always obey the government? The most misunderstood political verse in the Bible. One of the most quoted and most controversial passages in the Bible is Romans 13. The Apostle Paul writes, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established." At first glance, the meaning seems straightforward. Obey the government. Respect authority. Don't resist those in power. But what happens when the government becomes corrupt? What happens when leaders become oppressive? What happens when the law itself becomes unjust? Does Romans 13 require Christians to obey every government, every law, and every ruler no matter what? Throughout history, this passage has been used to support kings, emperors, dictators, and political systems of every kind. It has even been used to justify slavery, segregation, political repression, and the silencing of dissent. But is that what Paul actually meant? To answer that question, we need to understand the context. Paul wrote Romans while the Roman Empire ruled much of the known world. This was not a democracy. Citizens did not vote for emperors. The government could be brutal. Many early Christians would eventually be imprisoned, persecuted, and executed by Roman authorities. So, why would Paul tell believers to respect governing authorities? One reason is practical. The early Christian movement was small, vulnerable, and often misunderstood. Paul wanted Christians to be known as peaceful, law-abiding citizens rather than violent revolutionaries. But that does not mean blind obedience. In fact, the Bible contains numerous examples of people disobeying governments when governments demanded something contrary to God's moral principles. Consider the Hebrew midwives in Egypt. Pharaoh ordered them to kill Hebrew babies. They refused, and the Bible praises them. Consider Moses. He confronted Pharaoh and challenged an oppressive system. Consider the prophets. Again and again, they spoke against corrupt kings, unjust leaders, and the abuse of power. Consider Daniel. He obeyed many laws of Babylon, but when ordered to stop praying, he refused. Consider Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They refused to bow before the king's golden image. Consider the apostles in the book of Acts. When authorities commanded them to stop preaching, they responded, "We must obey God rather than men." Think about that statement. It creates an important principle. Government authority is real, but it is not absolute. According to the Bible, all human authority has limits. No government is God. No leader is God. No political party is God. No nation is God. When governments promote justice, protect the vulnerable, and preserve order, they fulfill an important purpose. But when governments become oppressive, demand evil, or violate fundamental moral principles, the Bible contains many examples of faithful resistance. So, what does Romans 13 actually teach? Many scholars argue that Paul is describing the ideal purpose of government. Government exists to restrain chaos, punish wrongdoing, and encourage the common good. The passage assumes rulers are acting in ways that serve justice. But what happens when they do the opposite? History provides countless examples. Nazi Germany, apartheid South Africa, totalitarian regimes, corrupt dictatorships, systems that denied basic human rights. Would resisting such systems mean resisting God? Many Christians throughout history have answered no. In fact, some of the most influential Christian figures actively challenged unjust governments. Martin Luther King Jr., Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Desmond Tutu, Oscar Romero. These individuals believed their faith required them to confront injustice rather than remain silent. But notice something important. Their resistance was generally rooted in moral conviction rather than hatred. They challenged systems. They confronted injustice. They advocated for human dignity. Yet they sought a higher standard than mere political power. Perhaps that is where Romans 13 is often misunderstood. The passage is not necessarily teaching unconditional obedience to every government action. Rather, it acknowledges the importance of social order while recognizing that all human authority remains accountable to a higher moral authority. This creates a difficult balance. On one hand, Christians are called to respect laws, pay taxes, and contribute positively to society. On the other hand, Christians are also called to defend the vulnerable, pursue justice, and speak truth when power becomes abusive. Sometimes those responsibilities exist in harmony. Sometimes they come into conflict. When they conflict, believers throughout history have wrestled with a difficult question. When does obedience become complicity? And when does resistance become a moral responsibility? Romans 13 does not eliminate that tension. It simply reminds us that authority has a purpose. But the rest of Scripture reminds us that authority is never beyond moral accountability. The lesson may be this: respect authority, support justice, promote peace, but never confuse human governments with God. Because throughout the Bible, the greatest heroes of faith were often those who had the courage to obey their conscience when power demanded something wrong. And perhaps that remains one of the most important lessons for every generation.